Okay. So STEPS is an acronym for Show the Easy Place to Start. And one of the things that we did when we kind of realized that maybe this would kind of be a community of people that get together fairly regularly, was we wrote something down about what we thought that meant. And then over the last couple of months have sort of revisited what we wrote to kind of make it something that was more evolving and personal to each of us. And so those of you who've been to sort of previous gatherings might have heard a version of this before, but I revisited it myself this morning and made my own kind of little tweaks and builds. So I'm going to read it. So it will be familiar-ish to some of you. And for those of you who haven't been with us before, hopefully it will sort of ground you in what we're doing here and what the tone of the next 50 minutes is going to be. So, STEPS. Show the easy place to start. As we navigate these transitional times, feeling our way in this emerging territory of regenerative practice, whatever that is exactly, we find that there seems not to be an obvious path to follow. With many questions needing a response, yet no single answer to guide us, we look for the footprints of others to see where we might choose to take our own next steps. Even the most experienced travelers in these spaces would admit that they're continually finding their way, unsure of what is around the next bend or over the next peak. This is an ongoing, unfolding dance with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, doing before we think too much and thinking before we go too far. So although taking the first or even next step can often feel like the hardest and most insignificant, know that you are not walking alone. Whether or not your own trail will become a valuable path for others doesn't really matter. We help each other towards a better tomorrow, not as experts, but as people, parents, neighbours, colleagues, and citizens. All our stories are unique and all our voices are welcome. There are many paths up the same mountain. So that is what the latest iteration of kind of how we're coming together, or sort of what's orientating us. And important to say that this is one of so there are many different sort of formats and STEPS Collective experiences. So last time, Laurie was presenting and Irit was presenting and John was talking all about gardens and garden spaces. And maybe that was an example of doing things. This is probably a session that is more in the reflective, inspirational place. And for these sessions, each month we are taking a different word as a theme. And I chose the word wild for this month's theme. And in just a moment, I am going to share a Miro board because we're going to do something a little bit different in today's session. But those of you who know me and those of you who know the pedagogy or experience of Schumacher College will know that we like to start in a place of kind of feeling something before starting to think and talk and particularly explore action. So I have a poem for you, which will be on the Miro board. So you'll be able to read it then. But for now, I'm just going to read it out loud. It's a poem by Wendell Berry, and it's called The Peace of Wild Things. And so for this, definitely feel free to go camera off or shut your eyes or lie on the floor or however you like to be read to. The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief, I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. So, I'm going to pop a link to a Miro board into chat. Hopefully, many of you use Miro day in and day out and won't be too overwhelmed by the technology. But if it's a problem or it's creating any friction for you, then do say, and I can share screen, or we can help each other out. But hopefully, you've made it into the board. And welcome everyone who joined since I started talking. So I'm just going to bring you over to this bit of the board, which has the start of a sentence. When I think of the word wild, I think ... and a bunch of blue Post-it notes that we can make more if we need. But what I would love for you to do, just initially on your own, is to take a Post-it note and just respond to that prompt, that when you think of the word wild, what does it make you think? So please feel free to kind of carry on writing. If you zoom out a little bit on the board, or actually, forgive me if you're right in the middle of typing, but I'm just going to pull you to the view that I can see just so that I can explain what else is here. I've just got some prompts on the other side over here, just kind of some questions to think about. So up at the top, there's this question: what might we need from wild, wildness, wilderness? These are all kind of slightly different things, but a question of what we might want. And at the bottom, and there's this question: what might be needed of us? And then in the middle, two questions: so what now and what next? And I'm going to pop you into pairs to talk with someone else to explore what your reaction was to that original question and how you're feeling about these other questions. You don't need to feel restricted to, I must answer the questions or I must get through all of them. Just use them to shape a conversation. And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to smush two pairs together into fours. There might be some fives, and then we're going to come back together. So there'll be about 20 minutes where you're in smaller groups, initially with at least one other person, and then with slightly more people, and then we'll come back together. So is that all right with everyone? So I'm going to open breakout rooms, and I'll let you know when the time is drawing to a close.
It's always an inopportune moment, Lizzie H.
Well, yeah, I was going to say there, it's like you're even trying to, but you're still trying to control the outcome.
Right. Well, maybe that's Shannon's thing about trellising. Anyway, hi, Lizzie S.
Welcome back. I'm sorry. There's always there's no elegant way of doing it, although it's nicer than screaming over people. So by way of coming back into whole group conversation, rather than anyone to share what they were talking about, just take a moment and reflect on something that someone else said that you thought was particularly interesting or powerful or important to share with everyone else.
Our group talked a little bit about, I can't attribute to a single person, but that wild is scary for most people, that there's a fear associated with the letting go of control.
Did that come up in the other group?
Yeah, we talked about wild versus tame a lot, and nature and rewilding, but also tame as a like wild and tame as a human mindset. So we've also tamed ourselves. It definitely came up.
What was the acronym again that you came up with, John?
Oh no, not me. Kirsten's. While without intentionally limiting direction.
I love that.
I'll put it on the board.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'll put it in the chat as well.
Someone's just put it on the board. They've beaten you to it.
We stole it from our little first half conversation where that came out, and then Leah remembered what it was. So
Excellent.
Got you. In our group, there was a reflection that was impactful for changing the relationship with wildness to be less hierarchical. And so instead of thinking of wildness as Mother Earth or that kind of relationship of, giving to us, but thinking of wildness and nature as a lover in a partner relationship. It's really interesting. And there's a concept called ecosexuality.
It came from me, and I really, really love that idea. Like the idea that we see mothers as eternally giving, and like maybe that's problematic in itself, right? But that's a different conversation. But if we instead change the metaphor for Earth as an equal or as a partner, that then it's not this eternal giver anymore, but somebody we need to work with. I really love that.
Reciprocal.
Yeah.
Plus, that brings up mutuality in terms of relationships. I think it implies, mutuous.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about a shifting state. So we discussed a little bit that like we maybe associate wilderness with freedom and connection and security, and in isolation are more on the tame side of things. But people don't just need one of these 4 things, we need all of them. So like something about wilderness is that it's in an ever shifting state, and we want to accept that. And a lot of us struggle to.
I think one of the things that came up at the start of our chat was weirdly it was me, Lizzie, and Shannon, and there was just this. All of us went like it feels like the natural association with wild is kind of thinking out there, something out in the wilderness kind of thing, but all of us spoke about it in terms of like some kind of personal experience of what wildness was, like more of an internal experience, which I just thought was kind of it was contradictory to my expectations, so it was kind of interesting. And I think part of what that represents in our conversation is this kind of like the false separation from the external environment. It feels like if you're trying to relate to wilderness, then it's a kind of you are in the wilderness yourself, which is just kind of intriguing.
Okay, so related to that, we talked about kind of complexity, and the wild bringing a sense of complexity, how we can be both isolated and connected at the same time, as in we can feel separated from wildness and also connected to the wild at the same time, and maybe that's kind of some of the beauty of wildness, is that it can be all of these things and kind of complex.
Yeah,
We were talking. Sorry.
talked a little bit about language and the use of the language is in some ways sort of taming the world or creating a way to interact with the world. So even the use of the word wild starts to pull you into I don't know whether wild's actually outside of linguistic expression in a way. So it's and I'm also really interested actually, you hear all that stuff around that we were talking about ecosexuality and Lover Earth. You know, you don't have a sexual relationship or an emotional relationship with an inanimate object. So it inherently kind of assumes that the Earth is well, Pins is like going maybe whoever, but you know what I mean. It's like sort of assumes that the Earth is a living and animate object, which is just obvious in many ways, but it's something that just occurred to me.
I was going to say exactly the same thing about words, and I'm just like slightly weirded out that you said it, because it's like I think of going beyond words, and I think we have a lot of abilities that we don't tune into, and words. From like I was talking a bit earlier about doing massage, and it's like I think when I did my massage training, there were people that we said for us, talking isn't our first language. It's touch and other things, and so like that wildness is that need to like not that sorry that when we're talking about taming. Sorry, where's it? Like sorry, going back, there was a quietness before you spoke, and we both went to speak at the same time, and it was like it's almost like we weren't coming up with that. That was there to be picked, and like we've lost that in the world because it's like no, we must know what we're doing rather than allowing things to like grow and come up. But yeah, and there's a fear of not being able to speak, I think. Does that make sense? I don't even know what I'm saying now. I'll leave it there.
No, that growing and coming up thing is and I'm going to reiterate this thing for the benefit of all that we came in at the beginning with Lizzie H, which is the kind of like trellising versus scaffolding. So I mean, I think most people on this kind of like call will have been in workshops and stuff and go, oh, we're scaffolding people up to this thing, which is a very kind of like built carpentry metaphor to something else we touched in the group earlier with Leah. But trellising was a word that Shannon introduced. And just that idea of sort of like you plant a bean underneath a trellis and you go, well, I've given you something to grow up into, but you might decide to go around the corner of the shed or over to this place or whatever else and so on. You go, the offer is the trellis, but you don't have to grow in that direction in that specific way. But at least there's something there for a bit of support if you want it.
It makes me think of Germany, where my family live. Is very popular to have trees. They're called tree schools, and they are shaped into swerves and patterns, and they're really regimented, like really well-shaped things, and they're called tree schools. And my dad every time pointed out that he's like, we have kindergartens and you have tree schools.
It's funny that in German, exactly, the word for a place where you leave your children to grow or to be cared for is Garten, right? Which to me contains both enclosure and garden. And of course, garden and enclosure are linked. But we don't have that. Well, apart from the fact that in English we use the German word kindergarten, but we don't. Yeah, I'm trying to think what the French say. Anyone know what the French say for a kindergarten?
Yeah, this is also really funny, Pins, because we do use that, because in British English we say nursery, but that's also the word we use for somewhere we grow plants.
True. There we go.
Yep, going on with that.
Yeah, same in the US.
What I also find interesting, because you're talking about this trellis, I've got this grenadier growing, and it's so interesting. I have a trellis standing there that I want the grenadier to grow on, but I haven't put it in its place yet. And how that grenadier is finding its way, finding its own support. And it's a wild thing, just growing in its own wild way there. And I think it relates a little bit to what I also said earlier in the group, how nature in one way is wild, but at the same time, it has its own control. And little seedlings break through quite a heavy layer of soil and and leaves and find their way out into the light. They grow according to certain seasons and the weather, which also actually follows something that is not necessarily wild, but in a way also controlled. Yeah, just find that interesting.
And wild's definitely not just about growth either. A lot of it's about decay. And there's a really interesting poet, Mary Ruefle, who what she does is takes books and just leaves them in the garden and then just watches over the next 20 years as it sort of gets grown over and decays and becomes part of something different. And just thinking about words in that context as well, how that, what's actually happening to those words, where those words come from, where they're going to. I think decay is a really important part of wild. And again, that's something we try and control, isn't it? We try and control decay. And avoid it.
John, that could be the other D, right? Without intentionally limiting decay, because we're so afraid of decay as a species, right? Like we only want the good parts of nature, but decay is an essential part of nature.
I wonder if that's because we're very aware of our own mortality and maybe not everything in nature is.
Yeah, and decay is also, I mean, parts of decay are harmful. We're like programmed to stay away from feces and stuff like that for a good reason, but
It's what, I know the word regenerative is part of this whole session, so I'm new here, but and that's also, I think, really interesting when you start to think about regenerative. Is there a limit to regenerative, right? So does it finish somewhere? How does it work when does the world just continue to regenerate and grow, or does it regenerate and within a donut limit or whatever? How does that all work?
I always think of it in the panicky theory. You have like growth, something, conservation, decomposition, and then possible renewal, or just kind of like maybe it goes somewhere. But generally, things do kind of cycle back round.
Yeah, the act of composting.
I keep thinking about these words and everything's got re in front of it. And it's like we say we recycle, we regenerate. Why is it not? Is it because we've pushed, talking about decay, is it because we pushed, I don't know, is that being pushed out? And we just think of these things as not a cycle, even though the word is cycle? I don't know. Am I making any sense? That's sort of like, why is it not just generative? Because and assuming that decay is when you generate something, it will decay, not that it just, I don't know.
What's recay? If you get decay, can you have a recay?
Yeah. It's also,
Decay is
Is it-
falling off. Cade, it's to fall in Latin and in Italian, modern
Okay.
Italian. So I suppose you could re-fall, but would imply you'd have to get back up.
Back up.
Well, I suppose the
We
core.
always get back up, pins. We always.
I'm thinking from a carbon perspective, as in literally, when the body breaks down, right? Okay, and then you decompose into gas. I mean, you don't actually, nothing actually disappears, does it? I'm not a scientist, as you probably spot by whatever I'm about to say. But my understanding is, the elements you were made up of are just going elsewhere. They're not. None of you actually disappears, really. You're just being reconstituted. Is that correct? So maybe you can recay.
Yeah, I like recay is like, it's the maintenance thing. If you're recaying, you're just getting back to that level to let it go again. And you're not trying to, like, regenerate does seem like flourishing kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but recay could be a more diminutive sibling.
I do think there's something interesting about the question of why isn't it just a cycle? Why is it a recycle? Why isn't it generative? Why is it regenerative? I think I think it's just a human challenge of actually grasping something that never ends. So we just think of it as like a start and a finish and a restart, but there's no actually starting and stopping point. It all just keeps going, but we can't, because we are liminal, like we are no limit, we're limited in this moment of time. So we're just like, we have to have starts and finishes, but you know, not everything has to. That things outside of us don't.
I'm working with a lot of farmers at the moment, and when you start to, you know, a lot of them are react very badly to regenerative as a term because it's not really defined within a farming context, and it's principles based, and it's, you know, they're like, well, it's easy to say regenerative because the opposite is degenerative, and no farmer wants to be degenerative. In a way, so it's kind of interesting to always think this opposites thing is always interesting, just to think about whether a term, you know, challenge yourself about whether a term works with the audience. Because if the opposite is just you would never even want to do it, then it becomes kind of self-fulfilling.
Yeah, that's like there's the broader strategy point, isn't it? It's sort of like you go, a strategy has to be a choice, and one usually between equally valid options that you go, I'm choosing to do this one at the expense of doing these other ones. And to your point there, you go, I'm choosing to be regenerative because if the opposite is to be degenerative, then that doesn't do me much good, does it?
So I'm just gonna flag that we're 1 minute to 2, and I know that many of you might have busy afternoons. If you don't, I'm not immediately rushing off, so you're welcome to stay if you want to continue to stay. But just kind of to pull it to a close, in there's so much kind of richness around relationships, hierarchy, control, how we put words to things, how we deal with the fact that we can make sense of things and that we worry about the future and reflect on the past, and how all of these things have all been provoked from this idea of wild. There was when I was thinking about, you know, this being my words for the session, the first thing that actually jumped into my mind was a passage from Tyson Yunkaporta's book Sand Talk, which some of you may have read or come across. And he's an Aboriginal Australian academic, and he was reflecting on the origins of the kind of Western public education system and its origins in 19th century Prussia. And it was founded on kind of 4 core principles, which were to create an obedient army and compliant civil servants and a homogenous population that kind of acts and thinks alike. I can't remember the 4th one. It wasn't any better. And his reflection was that the sort of 200 years, I guess, of sort of this industrialization and modernity is sort of characterized by the domestication of the human being in a way that didn't happen before, and particularly through this conversation, through the education system of, you know, literally breaking children to be obedient and sit in one place and be those people. And so in that reflection and to that previous point of, you know, making equal choices between things, and not that we're choosing between wild and whatever you might have decided as the opposite of wild. But I think a lot of what we do in these conversations is become more aware and be more mindful and intentional around the words that we use and the actions that might follow as a consequence of those words. So thank you so much for being here and spending an hour of your time. If you don't have to rush off, you're very welcome to stay. And if you do, then drop off whenever you need to go. And we have a few things, I think, coming up. I'm sorry, I really don't want to pull my blind down. The sun is very bright, so just shifting over and over. And I think we will have our next online gathering will be in March, which I think Andy is hosting. And there is talk of a Sussex in-person meetup. We are thinking about whether we can fit in a deep time walk on Hampstead Heath before I move to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the invitation to the entire Steps Collective community, if you want to do a thing, the Luma calendar is open, and we would love for you to be able to use this as a platform to put stuff out there, get all of us to help you with it, engage in it. That's what it's all about. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Bye.
You.
Thanks, everyone.
Lizzie, are there